The lore of Doctor Who evolved very slowly. It was a consequence of various factors, the time when the show was made, its original intent and style of storytelling, etc. and so forth. Remember that it did take until the War Games, the 50th story and the last of the black and white era, to learn anything at all about the Doctor's origins. This was the first point it was unambiguously proved that he was a different species and not just a human from the future or something, and even then there was much shrouded in mystery, which continued throughout the 70s. Compare this to today, when the Doctor's right bollock probably has a Big Finish box set dedicated to it, and the only way to introduce any mystery to the character in the show these days is carrying out retcons that will end up quite unpopular, as Chris Chibnall found out to his peril. Back in the day, before the idea of an expanded universe even existed, the audience knew very little, and well, they liked it that way. But while it did develop slowly, it did develop. As early as the end of the second season with the Time Meddler, there were tantalising glimpses of the Doctor's past by having him meet a member of his own species. Then there was the post-regeneration stuff in the Power of the Daleks, gave a few glimpses into how his species lived, and of course the War Games, which rounded out the era, which while revealing a lot, still did leave a lot unanswered. So that brings us, I think, to this story, which is only a piece of the jigsaw. It would be another year before we found out the name of the Doctor's planet, for instance, and another 4 years before we'd actually get a story based around it, but I think it is underrated in the importance of developing it. As not only Doctor Who's first look at its past in a literal sense, it's the first time it takes a proper look at the history of the universe the Doctor inhabits. This is the first story I'm going to cover in a new ongoing look at the development of Doctor Who's lore, and particularly that around the Time Lords. It won't be a regularly scheduled thing like the Look at the Daleks I'm doing, just a sort of theme that we'll look at every so often, and I think the Three Doctors is a perfect place to start, for the reasons that I mentioned just now, and also that the only other logical start point is the War Games, and I have to be with you guys. Reviewing a 10-episode story is not really at the top of the list of things I want to be doing at the moment, particularly as I'm not far off thinking to do the only 60 stories is actually longer than that, so we're starting here. The War Games will be done another time. So, the Three Doctors. This story marks the beginning of the 10th season of Doctor Who, and it was intended to be one in which that milestone would be celebrated, but not at the expense of usual service. The idea to make a 12-part Dalek story which evolved into 2 linked 6-parters is an idea to discuss another time, but those stories themselves were not celebrations of the past, neither were the other 2 of the season. Of course, back then a science fiction show even making 10 years on the air was pretty much unheard of, so they were very much on new ground, and with no internet or home media, the market for shameless nostalgia baiting was far less developed than it is today. But they couldn't leave such a milestone completely uncelebrated, which led to this story. Now, I do find it quite funny this was first broadcast barely a month after the 9th anniversary of the show, and the entire season would play out before the 10th would be reached, but it was, the 10th season, which is a milestone in itself, even if it's not quite the 10th anniversary, so that's a funny curiosity and not much more. Now, the genesis of the story is well known. Barry Letts and Terence Dicks wanted to bring back Hartnell and Troughton for the anniversary story. Troughton was up for it, but Hartnell's health issues prevented him from doing more than appearance on the TARDIS screen. They also wanted to bring back Fraser Hines as Jamie, but he was unavailable, so had to give his part in the story they'd planned to Sergeant Benson. That explains his prominence in the story, blah blah blah. We all kind of know this, it's not really something to dwell on. It's important to bear it all in mind, but I don't think it's the most important thing to consider with the story. The Three Doctors was the first time Doctor Who truly celebrated itself. Aside from bringing back Hartnell and Troughton and playing into the history of the series, most notably by referencing the second Doctor's adventures with the Brigadier and unit and how that built into the third Doctor's era, it also for the first time looked at the history of the Time Lords, the effect the Doctor's heritage has on him, and the role of his people in the universe at large. Even despite how prominently they had featured in the closing episodes of the War Games and how they had sporadically featured across the third Doctor's era, the Time Lords had remained an enigma. They were mysterious and godlike, they seemed all-powerful and all-knowing. Which was perfect for the War Games and the Doctor's character in that story, how someone with such a strong sense of right and wrong and with such an anti-authority streak as the Doctor could be so disillusioned with a society that arrogantly stands above all else but not doing anything to use that power for good. It's a perfect thread for the conclusion of that story and indeed for the second Doctor's era as a whole. The problem though is that an all-powerful society of smug god beings, it's just boring. You can do it once, maybe twice, but it'll just be boring after that. You'll just be rehashing the same ideas, the same arguments, and the same beats over and over again. The way the Time Lords evolved over the first half of the 1970s until their presentation in The Deadly Assassin defined them, it was a move towards a different kind of all-powerful being, one in which absolute power has corrupted. Unfortunately, this itself would be taken too far in the late 1970s and 80s, where the Time Lords just became dull and stuffy, sitting around complaining or just being evil for the sake of it, but we're not here to talk about that yet. The idea of the Time Lords as they were in the War Games was never entirely gone, even in The Deadly Assassin, but it was changed. We still understand why the Doctor left, but it was because of corruption and bureaucracy that fed into the idea that the Time Lords not using their great power for good was unacceptable for him. Now, the idea of this presentation ruling of the Time Lords is very much a 70s and 80s fandom thing. The Deadly Assassin was regarded as a classic, and its presentation of the Time Lords is definitive even before I was born, so I'm not trying to refute some ancient argument, I'm just putting it into the context. Which brings us to the Three Doctors. It's a bit of an odd entry into the show's lore regarding the Time Lords. Obviously, there are no headdresses yet, they're a long way off, and the name Gallifrey won't be uttered for another year, but the basic foundations were there. 2 years earlier, we'd seen a Time Lord in Terror of the Autons, who was dressed as the stuffiest, most boring civil servant in history, arrogantly presuming superiority over the Doctor. That Robert Holmes would end up writing for Deadly Assassins on the basis of that is no great surprise. They also kept sending the Doctor on missions, clearly happy to exile him, but also happy to use him when necessary, which kind of did show their arrogance in that way. In this story, writers Bob Baker and Dave Martin built on that idea, by showing two particular strands in Time Lord society: the stuffy bureaucrats concerned only with procedure and doing things properly, and the arrogantly presumptuous, the risk-takers who would break cardinal rules on a whim. I do like how in this story neither of these two sides is to be considered truly right or wrong. We're generally meant to be siding with the risk-taker, the Chancellor or whatever he's called, over the bureaucrat, the President, but the former is breaking a rule preventing something very dangerous without really much thought for how it might play out. I mean, if Baker and Martin didn't mean us to think this, would they have called it the first law of time? Generally, if something is the first law of anything, I'd say it's pretty bloody important. The 23rd law of time? Fair enough, that's probably pretty minor, but the first? Now, there are some issues with the presentation of these scenes that I'll get to later, but I think in this small microcosm of Time Lord society presented in this story, we see exactly the kind of thing we needed to see in order to understand why the Doctor resents Time Lord society as much as he does. Well, aside from the whole exile thing, but you get what I mean. In a huge universe-threatening crisis, all the Time Lords can do is bicker and argue, with one taking the opinion that doing nothing is preferable to trying to end the extinction of everything, and the other thinking that just having someone meet themselves is a pretty minor thing that doesn't really require any thought or discussion, really. The other thing that adds to this is the villain of the piece, Omega. Omega is the first time that the history of the Time Lords, and essentially the distant backstory of the Doctor, had ever been explored. Now, Omega as a character, and indeed a story idea, I'm actually quite interested in. The idea of the great scientist, the one who sacrificed everything to lift his society to godhood, and his reward being eternal imprisonment, is to me at least a fairly fascinating idea, one which leaves many possibilities open. Indeed, the character's exploration here of how it's essentially turned him into a nutcase nevertheless retains that air of tragedy, and it's done very effectively. At no point do we think Omega is someone we should like or support. He is clearly the villain, and that's well laid out, but his position as a tragic villain is equally clear. We're supposed to feel sorry for him despite everything, and his presentation does work very well. The idea of the society of such elevated prowess being built off the back of a man who has been imprisoned forever and has been driven mad by it is to me the first time the Time Lords have truly been given depth, that the rot the society is truly based in and how that influenced the Doctor's decisions to leave. I also really like the Doctor's clear respect for Omega, that at no point does he consider him an awful villain. He of course never shies away from his duties to the people of the universe he needs to protect, he always places their lives above Omega's, but the genuine regret displayed by the Third Doctor at the end is really well written by Baker and Martin and performed by Pertwee. It adds to the gravitas of Omega's appearance here, that this is the first Time Lord we've ever seen who the Doctor actually respects, that this is someone important and a long time ago, somehow worth revering. It also adds to the tragedy of his fall, again forcing the Doctor to trick someone he respected into destroying himself, but also clearly demonstrates to the audience that Omega was once great enough to elevate an entire society to godhood, and how he's just been tricked by a recorder. It's a bit silly perhaps, but also one that shows how even the best of us can be broken. Also, it's nice to be given some history and backstories for the series, frankly. It's an interesting development to learn who built all of this, so I like that as a nice part of it. Stephen Thorne's performance as Omega has become, well, let's not beat around the bush, a bit of a meme over the years, and having been accused of being over the top, and yeah, it's over the top. The overacting does get a bit too much. I don't think it's bad, though, minus a few moments. The scream where he finds out that the antimatter has truly eaten him away should be a moment of pure tragedy, that his final hope of escape has been totally dashed, and instead it's just... yeah, sorry, there's no saving that even as a meme. Overall, though, I think the bombacity works in the character's favour, although even this can go a bit too far. We get the idea that it's a truly enormous figure, so it kind of works, but it's still a bit too over the top, and I do wonder if a bit more of a mix would have worked much better as a performance. Like, still some of the more over the top moments with having be all bombastic, but also some quieter, more subtle ones as well. Instead of that silly scream upon finding out he doesn't actually really exist anymore, a quiet rage, perhaps no more than a whisper, that I think would have worked a lot better. Having said that, the overacting is actually very entertaining in its own way, so even if it doesn't have as much gravitas as it should, I'll still give it a pass. So overall with the lore stuff, this is a major point that I think goes a bit under the radar in terms of development of the Time Lord stuff in the show's wider universe. The first signs of the Time Lords being quite a flawed society, and that was more to the Doctor's contempt for them, that does start out here, which is combined with a small but interesting examination of the origin of the Time Lords and how that represents how they are at this point. It's not exactly a huge part of the story, but it's definitely there, and it's one of the first times I think the show's lore did become an important part of its development. The other part of the Three Doctors as an exploration of the series' history is, well, the Three Doctors. Bringing back previous Doctors has been done so many times since then, but the novelty of it in this first time has probably become lost a little. But in my mind, this was both the very obvious thing to do, and quite a bold idea that could have gone very wrong if not handled properly. On the one hand, what other way would there be to celebrate by bringing back the older actors? Indeed, the way Doctor Who changes its lead cast makes this a very viable option, and can be done in a way that would be pretty easy to slot into the story without feeling cheap, and in a way that would be recognisable to the audience. Everyone will remember Hartnell and Troughton, so it'd be a nice nostalgia shot, and over days long before I remember that was an entire way of making television, a unique way of celebrating. On the other hand, having two actors share the limelight could have had the issue of drawing attention away from the current star, for instance. Handling their integration into the story properly could have gone wrong very easily by making it too obviously just a throwback to a previous era, for instance, just straight up turning this into a first or second Doctor story instead of just having the first and second Doctors and the third Doctor story as it should have been. There was also the issue of whether making this having be a story entirely based on a singular idea would have meant that making this, well, an actual story, one with a proper plot and characters, etc., would have been shunted to the side to make way for showing off the other Doctors. After all, putting the spectacle of whatever bright idea they've come up with above the considerations of actually telling a story has been a favourite tactic of those who make New Who for the past 19 years. Jesus Christ, has it really been nearly 20 years? Anyway, it's not exactly unknown for this show to pull that, so I think it was a real risk. So, did they succeed at taking advantage of those positives and avoiding the pitfalls? Well, mostly. As far as the appearances of the Doctors themselves go, this was a fantastic success. The second Doctor is used almost perfectly. He has plenty of time to interplay with the third, and their dynamic is just pitch perfect. In a way, every multi-Doctor dynamic since then has been a pale imitation of what was achieved so effortlessly in this story. The famous bits are early on when they first meet, but I do also really like a lot of the stuff later on in the story as well, when the interplay is based so much on their individual character dynamics and how they clash. The second Doctor is doing what he does best, pretending to be a clown while getting a complete grasp of the situation, while the third is a more direct and defiant character, refusing to bow to authority except when it's the only way to save lives and lead to the ultimate victory. They're obviously two very contrasting styles and so much good is made of it. But the second Doctor also has time on his own to shine in the middle of the story, which allows him to fully show off these character traits I mentioned, while also playing incredibly well off the Brigadier, which, by the way, is a frankly genius move. It plays on the fact that the dynamic between the second Doctor and the unit characters already exists, while allowing him to be integrated with the way that the unit dynamic is used in the third Doctor's era. Of course, Troughton, is magnificent. You can tell that despite leaving when he did, his passion and enthusiasm for the role never departed, and exactly the same subtle brilliance he always displayed during his time on the show is very much on display here. It is of course well known that William Hartnell's role in the story was envisaged to be bigger, but it had to be drastically cut back because of his poor health, to the point where in the story as it is, he only appears in pre-recorded inserts on the scanner. Now obviously this has to be borne in mind when judging the first Doctor's appearances in this story. Yes, obviously it would have been much better for the first Doctor to be as involved as the second was, and have his own character be in the dynamic, but that just wasn't possible, and so they made the best of what they could, and overall it does work. Sadly, you can very clearly tell Hartnell was very ill when they made this, and his performance is as you'd expect as a result. He's reading off a cue card, and it shows. But there was nothing he or anyone else in the production could have done about that, so you have to go with it, and the credit goes to him for still very much embodying the spirit of the first Doctor despite that. He still has the same stern energy, and is able to sometimes put a bit of force in the words, just as the first Doctor was so good at doing. There's not much you can do in this situation, but nevertheless the idea of the first Doctor as the grumpy and stern yet good-hearted observer is very much present, and the authority and presence is still very much there. There's a great moment where the second Doctor says, "I've always had great respect for his advice," which I think answers the age-old question of why all the other Doctors think he's some old fountain of wisdom despite being younger than them, and the answer is that his personality simply lends itself to that, and it's very much on display here. But the key thing is that this was still Pertwee's show. They correctly didn't allow him to be overshadowed by the other two. The way they approached this, to allow Pertwee to have the lead as the story built up in the first episode, allowed the audience to be comfortable with the familiarity of the standard stuff to expect from this era, and allow us to be reassured that it's still very much the third Doctor story. While naturally the meat of the story has the second and third, and would have had the first if possible, having an equal role, it works out because this still very much feels, as it should, like a Third Doctor story for two reasons. Firstly, because of the way the story is set up to have those familiar Third Doctor elements like unit, but secondly because the main character beat of the story is that of the Third Doctor. He starts in the familiar unit surroundings, very much at home with how his exile has ended up, which of course contrasts with Omega, similarly in exile, and yet it has driven him mad. It's an interesting motivation for why he ends up so regretful about Omega, a man he respected driven insane by imprisonment away from the world he wanted to inhabit, and thinking about how it mirrors his own experiences, and well, what could have been. I also like that the story ends with the Doctor getting back the freedom of the TARDIS and his exile ending. Not only did this feel like a natural point to end the exile on the show terms, as they had realistically done all they could with it, but it also fitted perfectly into this character arc and this story. The Doctor achieves the freedom Omega could not. So having this focus be on the Third Doctor means it still ultimately feels, as it should, like his story. That leads me into another thing I want to briefly touch on, which is the supporting characters of the piece. Obviously there's the regulars at the time, and they do what they need to do very well. Jo is the down-to-earth yet reassuring presence, and while I do actually like the character of Jo a lot, especially with how her character arc plays out over 3 years, and I think Katy Manning is a fantastic performer, this isn't really a story where she's the focus of the attention. She does have her moments of course, and it just shows how much her character grew and changed over her time on the show, so overall it's a good job, there's just not much to say. Brigadier Lethbridge-Stewart and his character is overall a discussion for another time, but as said previously, he is used to excellent effect here in being a bridge to the Second Doctor and allowing him to be integrated into the story pretty seamlessly. And well, the look the Brigadier does when the Second Doctor appears should frankly have won Nicholas Courtney an award, so it's all good there. Although I have to wonder if Hartnell's illness meant an opportunity was lost. He could have been pointing out how similar he looks to that Brett Vion fellow. Anyway, the Brig's general character arc is at play here, and while it doesn't really add anything new, just like how it was with Jo, it's effectively handled. That he disagrees and argues with the Doctor, and can be very impatient with him, especially when it seems like he's turned back into that short fellow with the black hair again. But the final salute he does as he leaves them shows on the basis of the mutual respect that nevertheless defines them. It's hardly unique to the story, but it's executed well. Finally, there's Sergeant Benton, who took on the role intended for Jamie in the story, but it's been rewritten sufficiently to more suit Benton's character than it would Jamie's. Benton was always a nice side character I liked. John Levine plays him with such likability, which helps. His seeing the inside of the TARDIS is a nice moment, but he doesn't really do too much else to note, but that's fine, he's there just to support, and support he does. So with that, I've conveniently at this point reached the end of the stuff I do like about a story, and there was a lot of it, but we're now moving on to the stuff that doesn't really work for me. Firstly, I'll briefly touch on supporting characters other than those regularly featured, as they don't really work. Well, that's not quite true. They're frankly barely even characters, they're just plot points. There's Mr. Scientist Man and hilariously rural bloke, and I've more or less described their characters entirely there. Especially with Mr. Scientist Man, it just feels like what character he does have varies wildly from scene to scene. Firstly, he's just a reasonable scientist, then later he wants to escape despite all the evidence suggesting that's a terrible idea, blah blah blah. It's just a bit by the numbers, there's no depth to it at all. Which I think actually is the story's big problem, and why, despite all the good stuff about it, it doesn't quite achieve what it should. I said earlier that they should have avoided putting the spectacle of the multi-Doctor approach ahead of telling an actual story, and, well, they didn't really succeed at that, I'm afraid. The actual plot is not great, it's just a bit too sedate and by the numbers, as if it's been designed to just be a vehicle for what else the writers intended to do with it and nothing else. It feels very underdeveloped and not paced well. The setup happens very quickly, going from nothing to antimatter destruction of the universe really quickly, but the middle does feel very padded, with an awful lot of walking around the quarry not doing anything in particular. Nowhere is a sedate feeling from all this more apparent in the fact that the people who have suddenly been transported to this other world act like this is the kind of thing that happens to them every other week, and it's stuff like this that contributes to the feeling like there's just lack of scope to it. The continued back and forth in Omega's lair also gets a bit tired and quickly, and you get the feeling that probably could have been trimmed down to fit the last episode, with a little more meat on the bones during the middle of the story to compensate. It's not awful or anything, it's just not particularly engaging, and it's a shame because of how engaging the character dynamics are. It also does feel quite padded and almost redundant sometimes. Like, for instance, the Time Lord stuff I mentioned earlier, the risk-taking guy comes up and says, I want to break this law. The cautious one goes, if you insist, but it's your responsibility. Then 5 minutes later he turns up again and goes, I can't believe you did such a thing, even though he'd literally just signed off on it. Their bickering is an interesting thing to establish, but it's dragged out way beyond the point where it stops being interesting, and it's kind of symptomatic of the problem. It does feel like the plot is so sedate in the film because there's just so little of it. The Time Lord conflict, which should take up a few minutes, has to be stretched out just as everything else does. Perhaps it's something that's a little difficult to quantify, but it's not quite there. Maybe it's just a draft or two away, or maybe it needed a rethink, I'm not sure. It just doesn't really work, and it's a shame because, as I said, the character dynamics are so good, but also because I think the stuff with Omega has so much potential. And to be fair, some of the way that part of the plot is executed does work, particularly the reveal of how Omega has been destroyed by the antimatter. but even then it's not perfect, particularly when Omega attacks the Doctor with the dark side of his mind, ooh, which ends up with John Pertwee fighting a guy in weird makeup in what looks like the director's attempt to emulate an acid trip, and it's about as pathetic as it sounds. So yeah, overall the plot is not as good as it should have been. So I'll finish by briefly touching on the production side of things, which I've not really talked about much so far, as it's fairly unremarkable. Director Lennie Mayne, who is best remembered for calling the Alpha Centauri costume from The Curse of Peladon a giant green dick, does an okay job. The pacing does suffer at points, and I don't think his efforts help enormously with the feeling that things are feeling a bit sedate. Obviously, he could only film what he had on the page, but in particular I feel like the scene where the Doctors are sending everyone else back to safety is just way too slow and dull, far more show than it should be, forgive all the subject matter. In a lot of the places, though, he does keep the action quite tight, and in some places his choices do enhance the scenes, such as the close-up on the Brigadier when he first sees the second Doctor. So overall the job is fine, but to be honest the directing is not the part of production that probably requires commenting on. First of all, the choice for Omega's world as particularly boring looking BBC quarry was maybe not the smartest one. This universe completely under Omega's control that he's lived in for thousands of years, and he's turned it into a quarry. Right, I don't know, I feel like something maybe a tad more upmarket and imaginative might have been called for. It doesn't help the middle of the story at all, as the Doctor and Jo wandering around seeing all the awkwardly placed props is even less gripping entertainment than it otherwise would be, as all they're doing is just walking through a quarry. I don't know, maybe they just literally couldn't afford to film anywhere else, but it just diminishes the scope of the tale. The effects work is a mixed bag. I do actually really like the electronic effect they use for the antimatter monsters early on in the story. It's primitive, obviously, by modern standards, but I think it actually does work really well. What doesn't work so well are the Gale Guards, who look like a bloke in an orange rubbing costume. I'm not sure why they were necessary when they had the electronic effect, which looked better and was more menacing, and would have saved them the money of hiring blokes to be in the orange rubber costumes, and, well, I don't like to criticise Classic 2's effects, but come on. On the plus side, I really like the design of Omega's costume, particularly the helmet, which does convey the stature of the character really well, so can't be all bad, can it? As an anniversary celebration, this story should be considered an unqualified triumph. As an actual story, it's just a fairly bog-standard by-numbers story, and it's disappointing because there is a great deal of potential here that isn't being realised. Maybe New Who's endless spectacle over substance approach based episodes just hardened me against this kind of approach, but as much as I like seeing the different Doctors and the character interplay and all that, it is disappointing that the story itself is pretty paper thin. Despite that though, it's hard to hold too much against this story. Seeing the three Doctors play off against each other is wonderful, even if one of them is limited in what they can do. The character interplay works really well, and the way it's constructed means that it's also one that celebrates the other characters of the third Doctor's era. In terms of the idea of the lore in which the entire review has been based on, I think the story does fly under the radar of how important it is in setting up that lore, and how that lore would be developed throughout the rest of the decade, in terms of Time Lord Society and its origins, and in terms of the Doctor himself. I'm therefore happy to call it a good starting point for where Doctor Who did begin to develop its universe more thoroughly, and well, manages to be a pretty entertaining ride at the same time for most of it, so who's to complain? So to the final score, and bear in mind this is just a measure of how the story holds up against the rest of Classic Who and nothing else, I've decided after some thoughts to award the Three Doctors a score of 5 out of 10, meaning it's typical of the quality you'd expect from Classic Who. Now, that is a good average to me, and indeed this is an entertaining story with 3 great Doctors giving some fantastic interplay and character work. There's a top-notch villain and some fascinating ideas to explore, and at no point is this anything other than some old-fashioned entertaining Doctor Who. It just doesn't really reach much above that, just because, well, it feels like it was written as that anniversary special first and not a story first, which is something even Stephen Moffat managed to do right, which should tell you something. The story itself is just too thin, and it has enough holes in it to prevent it rising any further. Still, I don't want to sound like I'm being too harsh about it. It is an entertaining ride, definitely. As these things go, it's a very worthwhile story, and definitely one that has its place in Doctor Who's history.